Starting off, obviously we're talking about investing with integrity. An introduction, my name is Anjelica Rivas. I'm from Houston and I lived in Austin since 2012. I've done all my schooling here. I went to UT for undergrad and grad school. And then for grad school, I studied community and regional planning. I went in with a big focus on sort of open space access to open spaces and just equitable access to open space, and kind of found myself being really interested more so in housing. I think partially because I really liked spreadsheets and like looking at how to make housing work, or affordable housing work specifically. And then after school, I started working for an accessibility consultant, which actually was less about, well, it's kind of both as social accessibility, but also physical accessibility, which was really interesting because there was a huge gap in my knowledge from school about actual architectural barriers to access. And so I really enjoyed that experience. And then this summer I transitioned to working for an affordable housing development consultant. And so I'll talk a little bit more about the type of work that we do, but basically I work for a company that helps developers receive the type of funding to develop affordable housing all around Texas. And I'm really interested in real estate as a tool for investing and creating social change. I haven't yet invested in real estate other than the fact that I've invested all of my education in learning about land use and to some extent like the understanding that real estate and land use is impactful and as a way to build wealth, but also has been used as a way to oppress people in a lot of ways as well. So just as an overview today, I'm going to go over sort of a historical overview of how real estate has been used as a tool of systemic racism in Austin. And I'm focusing on Austin because I know now that most people on this call are from Austin, but also to help just identify different policies that don't explicitly have race in them, identify how those have impacted the racial landscape that we see today and how it's affecting today's housing industry. And then I'll go into current policies and practices in Austin that reinforce racially inequitable access to real estate, and then talk about how to support equitable access to real estate as investors. So just quickly starting, and I wanted to say also that I'm focusing a lot on the east side and then as Hyde Park. I should also say I also live in Hyde Park, so I'm sure I'll see a lot of people who live in Hyde Park on this call on neighborhood walks later on, but I've learned a lot about this neighborhood, and it felt very personal because I've lived here. I lived here through most of the times when I've lived in Austin, so it felt I've done a lot of focus on kind of understanding the context of Hyde Park. So in the 1890s, Hyde Park was developed and it was advertised as exclusively for white people. And I'll show you the advertisement on the next slide, but basically that was kind of from then until, I guess, for the next 40-ish years, racial covenants were really, or private covenants were really heavily used. It was written into deeds. I'm pretty sure some deeds in this neighborhood still technically have it written in there that people can't sell to anybody who's not white, but it's obviously not legally enforceable anymore. I think it's just a big process to get things written out of deeds, but I have seen that it's still in some deeds. And then 1928, the Austin Master Plan, which institutionalized racism in Austin by segregating city services, because I think it was around 1917, the Supreme Court determined that racial zoning was not constitutional. So they basically decided that they were going to move all city services that were accessible to the Black population in Austin to the east side, which made it pretty much impossible for the Black population to live anywhere else. But prior to that, there was different Black communities in like all throughout different neighborhoods in Austin. So Clarksville population went from 16% Black at that time to less than 1% by 1950. And then 1934, the New Deal and redlining, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard of, and how the New Deal incentivized home ownership for some, but made it very, very inaccessible for Black population and other communities of color. And it's important to recognize that not only were these redlining maps drawn along racial lines, but also written in the underwriting, the FHA underwriting manual. It identified race as a reason that would determine, or that would a criteria for determining an area as hazardous and wouldn't make it accessible to getting insured loans. So here you see on the left, that's the original Hyde Park advertisement that under the photo you can see it says exclusively for white people. And then the top right, there's an excerpt from the 1928 plan that talks about, I thought some of the language was really interesting in that it says by determining or by moving city services to one area, it would eliminate the need for duplication, and it would solve the solution to the segregation problem, and sort of language where it was like, this is a necessity, but we can't do it through the other tools that we previously had. And then the bottom right is the redlining map in Austin. So you can see, you know, big populations where red was hazardous, and that's primarily on the east side, and that's where primarily the Black population lived and didn't have any access to insured loans, which put them also in a position to be subject to really predatory loan options. And then this is kind of where it starts getting into different policies that weren't very explicitly racial and understanding how that still impacted the landscape. So 1957, the Industrial Development Plan was really a catalyst for environmental racism because it pushed a lot of industry to the east side, and it also, that area was zoned as industrial. And at the time there was this thing called cumulative zoning, which basically said that anything down to the zoning, the zoning category that it was in could be built there. So that meant that on the east side, residences could be built there, commercial could be built there, anything down to industrial. But in areas that were zoned residential, industrial couldn't be built there. And so it exposed a lot of people who they could still have homes there, but it was exposing them to a lot of toxins and different negative side effects of having heavy industrial there. And then the 1960s was really a time for urban renewal, which caused a lot of displacement. It basically, in one result of the east side being zoned industrial, ensured that people living there didn't have access to home improvement loans, and so a lot of structures were becoming blighted and becoming abandoned, and basically to identify an area as eligible to be in the urban renewal program, there had to be 50 blighted structures, which just wasn't that difficult to find in an area that didn't have any access to home improvement loans. And so it just led to a whole process of just completely tearing out blocks and rebuilding them, and without any plan in place to provide housing for the people who were displaced once things were built again. So it was really just a process of moving people out and bringing new people in. And then this was also when I-35 was built, which created a big, obviously, barrier between downtown and then the east side and all of the west side of Austin. And then 1984, there was an ordinance called the Inner City Neighborhood Ordinance, which around this time, the city was looking at increasing density in and other types of development in central neighborhoods. And the inner city neighborhood ordinance picked out certain neighborhoods to protect from development, and which pushed all of the development to the east side. And I'll show on a map on the next slide which neighborhoods were protected. But it allowed for some neighborhoods, this is as Austin's growing and as people are recognizing that neighborhoods that are, you know, a couple miles from downtown should really have higher density than being very of more of a suburban feeling, because the city has grown and, you know, some of these neighborhoods are no longer suburban in any way. And so, but all of that development got pushed, and it was, again, when you look at what type of development, it wasn't necessarily development that was for the people who lived there. It was for new people. And then in 1986, they basically got rid of the cumulative zoning, and which meant that the east side was at that point only zoned industrial. But that's also thinking that's about 30 years in which people were living in areas that homes could be built there, but they were zoned industrial. So that's a lot of time which people didn't have access to loans, but were still being told that that was a residential sort of area. And once it was fully zoned industrial, that even made it harder to get home improvement equity loans or any type of federal funding from the federal government, because it was not residential at all. So here are two maps. One kind of overlaying on the right, overlaying the redlining map. The purple, what I outlined in purple, is the neighborhoods that were protected in the inner city neighborhood ordinance. And so, as you can see, those were all identified in that color as best or still desirable, and that's North Austin, Hyde Park, Old West Austin, Travis Heights, and Riker Woods. And then I just put a circle around where UT is for reference. So it's just interesting kind of looking at the development that's in those areas now, or how those areas often respond to new development, and kind of looking at the history of how they've been protected from development, or how development has been kind of the character of this idea of development, like how people think about development historically in those areas. And then moving on to the 1990s, the environmental movement was really strong, taking off, and this is sort of to also identify ways in which not every policy is explicitly good or bad. It's just that some things have a lot of are good in some ways, but have racialized impacts, and looking at how those policies guess who takes the burden of implementing the policies. So with the environmental movement, it protected a lot of West Austin, again, from higher density development, and it directed, again, just all of that development to the east side. And then 1997, neighborhood plans, which this is a really big thing and really relevant in Austin, because I don't really know another city that has as strong of neighborhoods as Austin, but Austin has extremely strong neighborhoods. In 1997, with the creation of the neighborhood plans, basically the neighborhoods were able to take ownership over the planning of their area, which I heard from someone one time who was part of that process of creating that neighborhood planning ordinance. And he was saying, you know, the intention was just to make it much more democratic and allow the neighborhoods to take ownership over these planning processes. But it really turned out where it was neighborhoods with more political power said the things they wanted and the things they didn't want, and then pushed what they didn't want onto neighborhoods without as much political power. So it really put a lot of power in the hands of all of the people who live in the neighborhoods, which again, there are positives and negatives to that because of just access to political power. And then the 2000s and kind of onward, there's been a big push for live, work, play development initiatives, which again are things that have a ton of, are really like, those are the areas that we usually want to be in. They're really walkable. It's how you can get, go to get coffee and go to work and go to a park, all in one walk, and they're really desirable, but they often also increase property values. And so directing all of that type of development to certain areas will, specifically to the east side, would increase property values. And a lot of times that also comes in with new, with higher density development, but doesn't always, and often doesn't provide affordable options as well. So it's it ends up being a way that kind of pushes a lot of people out and brings new people in. So I really wanted to go through that because I think, especially now, I think it can be really difficult to recognize different policies now that aren't explicitly racial, but they have racial impacts, and just different language that has been used to talk about, or different ways racial policies kind of take on different languages now. So I just to show that not any policy or anything is just good or bad. A lot of them, you just have to look at kind of the nuances and how they're affecting different communities and who's taking on that burden and whatnot.
And really quick, people were asking about Code Next, and that there was a lot of like resident pushback against it. A lot of people were very against it.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that work?
Yeah, so that's actually something that so when I started my planning program, it was actually a really cool time because it was right at the height of all this Code Next stuff, and so it was a really great thing to kind of learn off of. And when I was in school, on the affordable housing side, people were very pro Code Next because one big issue in Austin is it's actually really difficult and really expensive to develop here, and so developments are generally produce expensive housing, and part of that is how things are zoned and the fact that we have really low density really close to downtown, and so a big argument I'd always heard was that it's to be like, I took on the side of being very pro Code Next, and I still do agree with that. I definitely think this new land development code that is in the works right now is very similar to Code Next and does a lot of increasing, or it provides the opportunity for increased density. It's also not there. One thing I saw while being here in Hyde Park specifically, but some other central neighborhoods, was signs that had bulldozers on them and saying Code Next is trying to knock everyone's houses down, which is not true. That's not how that would work. It wasn't going to take people's homes from them. So I definitely think that I definitely think that Code Next, I'm more in support of that. But I do recognize, and one thing that's kind of come into my mind recently was that there was a lot of opposition from some neighborhood, or from some community groups on the east side, also being concerned about what that development would do to the east side, because they've also dealt with a lot of negative side effects of development. And so I think that that's one thing where I hear a lot of pro-development, anti-development arguments, and that's one where it's like, it's really not one or the other. It's just, I think generally it's a good thing because it would make the increase in density be more equitable and not all pushed to the east side. But I do also recognize that concern for people who have been on the east side and who have just seen development displace them so much. And so I definitely think that, I think that's definitely, even though Code Next is not around anymore, but the next land development code, I'm very much in support of higher density, and just creating a larger housing supply, because with such a low housing supply, prices are just like, they'll just keep going up. But so I'm generally in support of larger housing supply, but I do recognize that that's just another instance where I have been definitely trying to think more critically about it and recognize that it's not, at the end of the day, when you have to make a vote, you have to decide which side you're on, but it's not just good and it's not just bad either.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah. So looking at how race plays a role in real estate today, I kind of just was thinking about ways in which sometimes is language that we hear, and then also policies. And so I just kind of put together a quick list of how ways in which race is sort of embedded in real estate today. One is definitely the continuous rapid gentrification on the east side. That definitely can't be separated from the racial implications of that. And then also language, and I've seen some posts also from Open House talking about this, but just some language around like how neighborhoods are talked about if when neighborhoods talked about becoming cool or whether they were sketchy, or language about communities. I think it's really important to understand that with redlining, neighborhoods were determined as hazardous, and so I think that language kind of reinvents itself, and there's a lot of racial bias in how people describe neighborhoods, and particularly I always think when people say something is becoming cool, I always think like that neighborhood had a lot of really great assets for the people who had lived there, so it was really cool for a lot of people before this. So it's just there's definitely a lot of racial biases and racial implications to the language that we choose to use when we talk about neighborhoods. And then another one is, and this is more on the policy side, but neighborhood conservation combining districts. And we'll talk more about ADU policies, but that one really came to mind because that's a zoning overlay that you would never see in there anything about race, but the racial implication is that it makes it less accessible, among other things, it makes it less accessible to build ADUs because it requires a larger property to be eligible for an ADU, which makes it not as accessible for a lot of people to have access to doing that. And then also, and as we'll talk about more later, ADUs are a really great way in Austin, a really great tool in Austin for increasing housing stock without going through zoning changes. And so preventing that also prevents a lot of access to housing for a lot of people. And then another one is homeowners associations, and along with that is protecting property values. Property values, race has forever been kind of tied to property values, and that was a reason in preventing access to spaces for communities of color, was that the argument behind it was that property values needed to be protected, and then that's usually a big role of homeowners associations. So just recognizing that, again, that's not to say that the homeowners associations are out trying to keep people of color away. It's just recognizing the systems in place that have historically had those impacts. And then also another thing that is that homeowners associations it's speaking to homeowners and not to renters, and people of color in general are disproportionately renters, and so that just in and of itself excludes a lot of voices who are active members of communities. And then and a lot of these are just kind of arguments or kind of just language I see come up this came up in Code Next debates, this comes up in affordable housing oppositions and debates all the time, and people talking about neighborhood character and talking about how higher density would ruin neighborhood character. And I think it's always just really valuable to understand what is the neighborhood character that people are talking about and that's being protected. Again, I feel like I keep saying, but it's like they're not all bad or all good. It's just it's just thinking more critically about this language that doesn't explicitly have a racial element to it, but there's often impacts or it's embedded in there. Another one is parking policies, which you would not believe how many affordable housing deals die because people are really worried about there not being enough parking. And we are a very car-centric city, but parking also costs about $1,500 per parking space. And so having really high parking policies and parking requirements makes affordable, even if not income restricted affordable, but just more affordable options really difficult because people have to include that cost in rents and just the whole development cost in general. Another is, so I think one thing is Austin has been putting a lot of focus on addressing affordability in new land use policies, such as Code Next and the new land use code that's in the works. And I think that is a way that the city is not explicitly addressing race, but is implicitly addressing race because it's by putting a big focus on housing access. And another one is school funding being tied to property values or property taxes is a big way that creates inequitable access to education and just inequitable access to wealth building and through by tying school funding to property taxes. We talked a little bit about pro-development versus anti-development argument, which again, that's one where it's just you can hear the anti-development or the pro-development kind of go both ways on whether that's helpful or hurtful. And so I think it's really important to just think about what type of development, who's development for, and how is it being allocated across the city. And then, so the whole point of showing this is just that to show that it's really nuanced, and we have to be really sensitive to how race is being talked about and the type of language that's being used to either to sort of reinforce racial policies. And and if anybody has other examples that are coming to mind, I'd love for you to share. But let's see, I think actually I can open this chat. There we go. I figured it out. Yeah, well, I missed a lot, so I'm gonna have to go back and read these later, actually. But it looks, yeah, definitely.
Can you talk about why parking spots are so expensive? Like, why is that such a high cost of?
I mean, I think it's just, so specifically with new developments in parking garages, whether it's excavating the land or building a parking garage, it's just the materials cost, the entire cost of development is just really expensive, and just having the space for that, because sometimes a parking garage is half or is like almost the size of the residential part as well, and so it puts a huge cost.
Right. Okay. Interesting.
Yeah. Okay. So some initiatives to be aware of. We talked about the new land development code, and then also another kind of on top of Austin focusing a lot on housing. I think in 2017 there was a Austin Strategic Housing Blueprint, and part of that was the Affordability Unlocked Density Bonus Program. And so one thing I want to preface with is, in general, it's really difficult to build affordable housing in Texas because it's not, Texas has made it where we can't have inclusionary zoning, which means that inclusionary zoning basically makes developers create a certain percentage affordable whenever they build. But since we can't do that, we have to incentivize developers in different ways. And so a lot of the incentives, because our cost of development is really high, a lot of the incentives will be eliminating some of the permitting fees or allowing developers to build higher than the height requirement so that they get more units. And so this Affordability Unlocked program basically provides the opportunity for higher density, and not necessarily very high density. It's really allows for maybe a single family zoned area to have 3 to 4 units on there, or just not where it's jumping from one house to 50 units, but something just to provide more units on smaller plots of land. And so that has been a relatively new thing, but I think in general, most affordable housing programs require community support, and so it's something to look out for if there's ever an opportunity in your neighborhood to support affordable housing. I definitely encourage you to do so, because I think a big thing is just we need it. I think we definitely need to increase housing supply, but we really need to increase affordable housing supply. And Affordability Unlocked Density Bonus Program is one way that they're working on doing that. Another one, which this might be relevant to a lot of homeowners, is there's a new resolution to streamline the ADU process, which would make it easier for low-income earners to access low-interest loans. And basically the way that would work, I think it will probably, September is when the council's going to be approving designs, and then there's going to be a phase of approving financing programs and whatnot. But basically it is so that there basically be a booklet of designs that people would choose from, and that would decrease the cost of design, because you wouldn't have to hire someone specifically to design it. You would choose from a book and kind of put you in contact with people, and essentially just streamline that whole process, which would make it much less expensive for people to put those ADUs on their property, which that's generally been a big focus in Austin, because it supports housing in place. It supports, not only does it provide, well, I guess on top of it providing an extra income opportunity on your own property, I've also seen a lot of people who will sometimes move into their ADU. As they age, they'll move into their ADU and then rent out the larger structure. I mean, not necessarily as they age, but that's been one thing for, rather than being displaced, it's sort of been an opportunity to age in place and have someone else live in the larger property or larger structure. And another one, which this is actually available now, it's through the Alley Flat Initiative, which I included a link, but that's why it's green. But basically, it's with the Guadalupe Neighborhood Development Corporation and Community Powered Workshop, and UT all came together and put together this program, which basically does what this new resolution will do. I think that this new resolution was kind of built after years of seeing this be really successful, but they basically have a program in which you, because the Community Powered Workshop has architects on staff, so they'll design the ADU for you, and then they'll get you, I guess not in contact, but by agreeing to that, they'll waive permitting fees, so it costs less. And then in exchange, you are agreeing to have that ADU be accessible to people who make, I think it's 80% of median family income, and it's for a specific time period. So I think it's about like 2 to 5 years. I think there's a couple options, or at least there used to be, but a certain time period in which you would have it affordable to at a certain income level in exchange for those lower development costs. And I see Christine asked if I will email the resources, and yes, I will. And then another thing is just looking up all the different affordable housing development opportunities, and I really encourage you going to the Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs website and getting on their listserv, which I will also send a link to that. But you can sign up for emails from all of their different programs. But I will say that because most affordable housing programs need community support, that's a really great place to know what's going on, because I think a lot of people strongly organize around opposing these types of developments, but there's not a lot of organization around supporting these developments and showing up to council meetings and supporting them. But just to kind of put in context, for the type of affordable housing development that I kind of work in, it's called the tax credit program, or the low income housing tax credit program. And a bunch of developers are applying to get funding, which is tax credits that get passed on to the person or the entity that's funding the development. And basically, you have to get your state representative to support the project, write a letter of approval, and that letter of approval is worth 17 points. And in most regions, the point differential between someone who won the funding and someone who didn't is maybe a point, maybe 2 points. So if you don't get the 17 points, the deal is completely dead. And so that trickles down to us as community members, because there's usually, and in Austin there definitely is, a process for applying for that support. And so basically the state rep support gets trickled down to city council support, which gets trickled down to neighborhood support, which gets trickled down to people who live in the neighborhoods. And so we really have a lot of say in whether or not the state rep will provide that letter of support, and it really is a make or break thing. And so that's situations where I've seen deals just completely die because of parking requirements or just different things. But I saw an article earlier today talking about how that's really created kind of its own type of sort of way of redlining, in that it determines areas that are completely where affordable housing development is completely inaccessible, dependent on who the state representative for that is. So a lot of times developers will look through, and if they know the state representative is not going to support the deal, you have no chance in going after it, which makes a lot of areas really inaccessible for developing really high quality affordable housing. So that's one thing, and that I just want to encourage people to definitely check out that website and get on the listserv and just figure out ways that you can support these developments. Let's see. And then, so more explicitly, what we can do about it, I think a big thing is really focusing on advocating for inclusive policies. I think this is a political issue because policy is a tool of racism and it has been used to reinforce racism in different ways. And so as investors, it's really important to recognize the voice that you have in your communities and advocate for inclusive policies. I also think that this problem is caused from, originally from race-focused policies. And so we have to address it through policy, and specifically when possible, through race-focused policy solutions as well. So a couple things that, things that we can advocate for. Banning discriminatory zoning laws, which I would consider the neighborhood conservation combining districts part of what would be considered a discriminatory zoning law. And so something that could be advocated for is having that removed when a new land development code comes in, because otherwise those can go, since those are zoning overlays, those can go over whatever zoning code we have. So having those be removed, and yes, Hyde Park does have one of those. And another is I mean, it would be wonderful in Texas if we could have inclusionary zoning. I think that's definitely something that we should be advocating for. Texas is one of the only states that doesn't have inclusionary zoning, so I think that's definitely something we should be advocating for. And then, like I said, any type of affordable housing development, if you can get on any listserv or just find any way to understand or to know what types of affordable housing development is being could be opportunities in your neighborhood, I highly encourage you to support all of that. Another way we can focus is educating. So like I'd said, looking at how policies are shaping the landscape that we live and invest in. Racial policies evolve and they take on new names like parking requirements and like different things. And so I think just staying really educated on what policies are impacting the racial landscape of our neighborhood and our city. And then also investing in communities, not beyond buying property, but also investing in long-time businesses and investing in community organizations that are coming together to support long-term residents. So as an example is the Guadalupe Neighborhood Development Corporation, like I talked about. And there's a whole host of different community organizations that exist in the neighborhoods that a lot of us are investing in, and kind of seeking those out and becoming allies in those spaces as well. And just becoming involved in general in those organizations. And then the last is supporting renters. So like I said, renters are disproportionately people of color, and so by only amplifying the voices of homeowners, we end up not hearing from a lot of renters. So one example is in Austin, in Hyde Park, there's actually two neighborhood associations. There's Friends of Hyde Park and there's Hyde Park Neighborhood Association. And the Friends of Hyde Park is inclusive to renters, and Friends of Hyde Park Hyde Park Neighborhood Association, you can only, I'm almost certain you can only become a member through if you're a homeowner, but there's also different implications on you have to be able to attend a certain amount of meetings before you can vote, and just different things that aren't necessarily inclusive to all the voices of the community. And I know that Friends of Hyde Park was kind of formed as a way to provide better access to amplifying more voices, especially, Hyde Park has such a high percentage of renters with being so close to the university, so it really excludes a lot of voices. Any of these exclude a lot of voices when not including the voices of renters. And I think that's all I have.